Thank you, Francis. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And firstly, on my behalf, thank you, Francis, firstly for giving me the opportunity to come and work at this university, and of course also for hosting this evening tonight in the magnificent setting of the Brewer drawing room. I hope you can all hear me fairly well. I'm using a microphone, which I don't normally do. What I want to do tonight, as Francis has said, is really just plot a little bit of a journey around something that has always been very close to my heart, which is the application of sports science to help improve human performance. I've been given a number of tips on what to say tonight, and I'll just read these out because they will, I hope, help to set the scene. Things like make sure you choose an area that interests you, which I certainly have done. Make sure it's to some extent autobiographical and you weave in some of your personal experiences over the years. I'll try to do that without making it too boring. Make sure you throw in plenty of anecdotes. Well, I'm always one for anecdotes, so that's not too much of a problem. Don't make it too dry and boring. Use props to bring it to life. Make it interesting to everybody, not just academics. And finally, keep it short. We have to listen to you enough when you're at home. So, with those tips and points in mind, I'm going to leave the lectern behind. I'm going to play a little bit dangerous, and I'm going to talk without notes and talk from the heart, as I say, about something that is very passionate to me, and that is the application of science to help enhance human performance. So how am I going to structure the talk? Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of applied sports science, particularly focus on how sports science has in the past been applied to endurance performance, but then how, as sports science evolved, so more sports wanted to get involved in the type of support and the services that sports science could offer, and how sports science then really grew out into working with many other different sports, not just those traditionally known as endurance activities. I'll talk also about science of business, because as Francis said, I used to run my own business at Lilleshall, and then went to work for one of the biggest businesses in the world, in GlaxoSmithKline. As Francis also mentioned, I'm lucky enough to be on the board of UK AntiDoping, and I am very keen and passionate about the role that science can play in the battle to ensure that we have clean sport. And then as I come to a close, I'll talk about the glamorous side of sports science. That's how scientists can work together with athletes and coaches to help improve our opportunities to win medals at the highest possible level. And then finally, I'm going to speculate a little bit on the future and perhaps where sports science can go to push back the boundaries of human performance and to enhance our understanding and enhance our knowledge still further. So let's start where sport started, which is really the ancient Olympics, back with the ancient Greeks. And if we look at some of the science that the ancient Greeks had in many areas, it was actually quite advanced. But in terms of sports science, it perhaps wasn't quite as advanced as it was in those other areas. For example, in terms of nutrition, they used to advocate that athletes had no carbohydrates on the day before an event, something of course that we wouldn't preach today. They were quite right in suggesting that protein was an important part of an athlete's diet. Much of that protein came from dairy products. The richer athletes were able to get their protein from meat, but most of the athletes, as I say, got it from dairy products. And finally, when athletes got that post-exercise muscle soreness that today we will call DOMS, the great philosopher Hippocrates actually suggested that they went out and got drunk on at least 2 occasions a day to relieve them of the muscle soreness. There's some that suggested in some sports things haven't changed that much in the 2,000 years. Let's fast forward roughly 2,000 years to 1904, the scene of Salt Lake City, the Olympic marathon, and this gentleman, Thomas Hicks, who his supporters, surrounders, helped him to get to the finish line by providing him with strychnine to keep him going. Or strychnine is lethal and taken in high doses, and today would be banned as a stimulant. In order to refuel him, they gave him egg whites, and in order to hydrate him and to dull the pain, he too was given alcohol. Again, perhaps an example of people who surround athletes who may not always have their best interests at heart. Suffice to say that Hicks went on to win the event and become the 1904 Olympic champion, despite what today we would see as a very poor application of science to his personal performance. But let's wind the clock forward around 50 years now, to somebody who I think was probably the first applied sport and exercise scientist. Somebody who, when I was an undergraduate, really inspired me with the work that he had done to look at how the body responded and adapted to changes in work intensity, to changes in exercise intensity, and as well to changes in altitude. Because Griffith Boobs, a physiologist by trade, was actually the unsung hero of the 1953 Everest expedition. Because he decamped from his laboratory and he took part in a number of experiments and set up experiments high up in the rarefied air of Everest and was able to find out and to show how things like breathing frequency and tidal volume and ventilation rate all increased as exercise intensity was increased. He was able to show the impact that the rarefied air, of the oxygen, the lower oxygen levels, the impact that that had on the oxygen uptake of the individuals who were trying to climb mountains. And his application of science was fundamental in the success of that performance. He really was, as I say, very much the unsung hero. And I will, if I may, just briefly read from his obituary, which was published in The Independent in 1995. Griffith Pugh is best known for his contribution to the success of the 1953 Everest expedition. It was Pugh who insisted on the importance of adequate oxygen and of fluid for the climbers high on the mountain. This opinion was given not from the armchair, but from experience on the mountain and backed by meticulous scientific observations in the field. It therefore carried weight with the climbers, who could be sceptical of scientists whose work was confined to the laboratory. He went on to do important work on cold and hypothermia. When cross-channel swimming became popular, he worked on how the swimmers avoided hypothermia. He showed that only if you have a good insulating layer of fat can you withstand the hours in cold water. In 1968, the Olympics were held at Mexico City at a height of 2,300 metres, and Pugh studied the effect of this altitude on the athlete's performance. He predicted correctly that the altitude would increase times for long-distance events, but that the reduced density of the air would give a small advantage to sprint events. He investigated the deaths of young people involved in outdoor pursuits, and lessons from his work have been learnt by clothing manufacturers. So that despite the great increase in numbers venturing into the hills in all weathers, the cases of hypothermia have diminished. I would therefore suggest that Pugh really was the first genuine applied sport and exercise science, who was able to make a contribution to exercise, to sport, and indeed to business as well. And these are themes that I hope I'll be able to follow through the rest of this evening's presentation. But I will just take some time to read the final paragraph of this obituary, because I'm afraid there are some personal resonances with this. Anecdotes of his absent-mindedness abound. He frequently could not remember where he had left his car keys, or even where his car was parked, and would often take the train home and report his car stolen to the police. The story that on one such occasion his children were left inside the car remains unproven. I suspect he may also have taken his wife's car keys to work with him on the odd occasion, because I can assure you that's something that is very easily done. Moving on 10 years or so, and the development of the needle biopsy technique, which literally enabled scientists to get beneath the surface of the skin and to find out what was happening within the muscle during exercise. And one of the things that scientists found very fascinating to investigate was the level of muscle glycogen, the fuel store that there was within the muscle. And I remember being really interested, in fact greatly influenced, by a landmark study that was carried out in 1966 by Bergstrom and Holtman, where each of the two authors exercised one leg to exhaustion on a bicycle ergometer. And they measured the muscle glycogen in their legs before and after the exercise. Muscle glycogen is the fuel that we all use for moderate and high intensity exercise. So therefore it's no surprise that at the end of that exercise, the muscle glycogen level in each of their exercising legs was virtually zero. Whilst in the leg that hadn't done any exercise, it remained pretty much the same. Now for the next 3 days, Bergstrom and Holtman consumed a high carbohydrate diet, and at the same time took more biopsies to measure their glycogen levels. And they found that not only did glycogen quickly get back to normal, but that after 3 days, that it had exceeded normal by around 40%. In other words, they'd shown that a combination of exercise and diet was able to boost the body's fuel stores. And that was really the first time that we were able to see a practical application of science to sports nutrition and the enhancement of performance, because it led to what became known as carbohydrate loading, a technique that was adopted in the late 60s and early 70s by many marathon runners and endurance athletes, led of course by the famous Ron Hill. And the dietary regime that was advocated involved exercising to exhaustion to deplete the glycogen stores, 2 or 3 days on a low carbohydrate diet to keep those stores suppressed, and then 2 to 3 days before the marathon, a high carbohydrate diet to boost those stores above normal. Because the marathon runners were aware, not just from the Bergstrom and Holtman study, but from other studies, I have to say mainly conducted on bicycle ergometers, that they could boost those energy stores and be more successful at their endurance sport. So it really was a great example of how science, the science of nutrition, was applied to endurance performance and applied to the enhancement of running performance. And really that's something that then held true for most of the 1970s. And I think as scientists we were very confident that we could conduct experiments in the laboratory and apply those to endurance athletes. So we could measure things like oxygen uptake and lactate threshold and look at the correlations of those measurements between the performance that the athletes produced. And in a sense that's when I then started to become involved, because as Francis was said, I was fortunate enough to be offered a place at Loughborough University, a university long synonymous with excellence in the fields of sport, the training of physical education teachers, and of course in sports science. And I will pause to say that much of that reputation in sports science is largely due to my great friend and colleague, Professor Clyde Williams, and all of his hard work and endeavours at Loughborough, which have really been very much fundamental to the superb international reputation that sports science at Loughborough has had. Now I went to Loughborough as not only somebody who wanted to study sports science, but as an aspirational middle distance runner. I was Devon School's 800 and 1500 metre champion, and I thought I'll go to Loughborough and this will be my big breakthrough. I'll make my mark on middle distance running, I'll get coached and I'll get into the athletics team. But I went there in the autumn of 1980 and I'd overlooked one thing, or should I say one person. Because if you remember in the summer of 1980, Sebastian Coe wasn't just hitting the back page headlines, he was hitting the front page headlines as well, following his duels with Steve Ovett in the Moscow Olympics, and of course wearing the African violet vest of Loughborough in stadia all over the world, breaking numerous world records. And it very quickly became apparent to me that I wasn't going to make my mark at Loughborough as a middle distance runner, because there were plenty of other runners with far greater ability between me and the one at the very top, which was of course the Olympic champion, Seb Coe. And then something happened which really transformed my life, and that was a first year lecture where a gentleman called Steve Wootton came in. And Steve was looking for subjects to take part in his PhD thesis on intermittent high intensity exercise. And I willingly volunteered. And for the next 3 years of my undergraduate degree, I spent much of my spare time, just that spare time that wasn't in the library, in the laboratory, offering my body to science, giving blood, giving muscle, and taking part in various experiments, and really getting enthused and excited about the role that sports science and human experimentation could play in enhancing our understanding and in translating that understanding into improving the ability of athletes. But I still retained a hankering to do something with my running, and I realised very quickly that middle distance running wasn't for me. And this was the 1980s, and in 1981 the late Sir Christopher Brayshaw inaugurated the first ever London Marathon. So I decided I'd move up a distance or two, and so I entered the 1982 London Marathon. Now this is the only slide I could find of the London Marathon in 1982, at least the only one without Jimmy Savile in it. And this is the start, so it's a little bit blurred. And I was pretty fit in those days, and I had great aspirations of perhaps getting a top 50 under 20 ranking for the marathon. So I was still on the start line, just a little bit further behind these guys, and I set off with no real knowledge of science, no real knowledge of hydration, no real knowledge of correct pacing, and off I went. And all was going very well, until around 24 miles. And those of you in the room who've run the London Marathon will know that at the 24-mile mark there is an underpass that goes under a road and brings you out onto the embankment. I'll come back to that underpass a little bit later on in my presentation. And as I ran through that underpass, so things started to go a little bit blurry. And that's in fact the last thing that I remember. The next thing I remember is coming round in a hospital with a nurse looking down at me, wearing her Gillette London Marathon finisher's medal. And I certainly didn't have one. And I remember saying to her, gosh, you must be tired. You run a marathon, you come on duty. She said, no, the marathon was yesterday. You've had us all a little bit worried. Now, as those of you who know me, and as Francis said, I like to do a little bit of media work, but my first exposure to the media wasn't quite in the way that I was hoping. These are some of the headlines that hit the newspapers. If we scroll down on that one, which was in the Sun 2 days later, it actually says that I was given a 50-50 chance of pulling through. And having spoken with the late Dan Tunstall, the medical officer, I think those odds were just about right. But I did decide that I would be back. And I will, I'm afraid, show you this slide. Not only will I be back, I'll be back with hair. But I also decided that I needed to know what had happened, that I wanted to do further investigation and further research to find out why I had suffered from hyperthermia, the opposite to the condition that Griffith Boobs was investigating on Everest, and overheating and dehydration that had caused me to collapse and get into quite a serious situation. So, having been involved in the lab at Loughborough, I went to Clyde, and I was delighted when I was offered the opportunity to start my postgraduate studies at Loughborough, funded by the second sponsors of the London Marathon, which were then Mars. And I was very proud that my first paper was actually into the metabolic challenge of the marathon, the very event that in fact nearly killed me a couple of years earlier. And Clyde and I worked together in the lab, and we conducted experiments on the treadmill, running marathon runners, running people the distance of the marathon on the treadmill, collecting data, and we wrote this paper, which even today I think explains many of the basic physiological concepts that underpin endurance exercise. We looked at the relative exercise intensity that elite and recreational marathon runners complete the 26.2 mile distance at. We found that the elite marathon runners can run at about 80% of maximum. We looked at the energy expenditure, the number of calories that they use up completing the race. Again, giving really good advice on the nutritional requirements of marathon runners before the start. And we looked at their running economy, the amount of oxygen that a runner will use at any given speed. And all of that information went into that paper, which is still regularly cited. It was published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine in 1984, and it's one that I'm very proud of. And it also is one that has great applicability to enhancing our knowledge and enhancing the training advice that we can give to marathon runners. But as I say, I was sponsored by Mars, and they wanted us to look at how nutrition could impact on performance, and in particular to try to repeat some of the studies that had been done in the 60s and 70s, primarily on bicycle ergometers, but focusing this time on running, to see whether the application of carbohydrate loading, which was based on the cycling studies, still applied to running. In our first experiment, we ran our subjects at a constant speed, equivalent to 70% of their maximum oxygen uptake. And we did it first with a normal diet, and then with a high carbohydrate diet. And we found that with the high carbohydrate diet, they were able to run at a constant speed for around 20 to 22% longer after consuming carbohydrate. So again showing, as Bergstrom and Holton and many others have done, that if you could boost the carbohydrate stores, you could run at a constant pace for much longer. But if you're like me and you run a marathon, the last thing you want to do at the finish is to carry on running for another 20 to 25%. You'd rather stop and lie down. The genuine measure of human performance in sport is actually how quickly can you complete a distance in. And so we devised a second experiment, and this time we asked our subjects to run 30 kilometres, or 18.64 miles, both with and without carbohydrate. And this time we found about a 2.5 minute improvement in performance in the finish time of those runners over 30 kilometres after eating carbohydrate. A much, much smaller magnitude of improvement. But nevertheless, when it comes to sporting performance, particularly at the highest level, one that is extremely significant. But that word significant is also important, because unfortunately, when you're dealing with relatively small groups of subjects, as we were, when we had 9 in total, and one of them in fact ran slower, we weren't able to achieve the level of statistical significance that today, and even in the past, you have to have in order to be able to publish those findings and show that they are statistically significant. And that for me is always a problem that those of us involved in human experimentation come up with. Because when we measure true performance, and we want to see those small but very meaningful improvements that we can get in athletes by changing diet, or changing training, or going to altitude, those magnitudes are so small that sometimes the statistical techniques, compared with the number of subjects that we're able to recruit, make it very hard to show that statistical significance. Indeed, there was a paper published in the 1980s by Bland and Allworth, which actually suggested that we really shouldn't be using traditional statistical methods with human experimentation. And in fact, a more clinical approach, where we can say to athletes, you've got an 8 out of 9 chance or a 9 out of 10 chance, is something that is much more meaningful to them. The impact on those athletes is far greater. But we were very pleased to be able to show that we could enhance both endurance capacity and endurance performance by manipulating and changing the diets of those athletes. And again, I think what we had at that time, in the early mid-1980s, was an environment where sports science, not just at Loughborough, but in many labs around the country and around the world, was working very closely with endurance sport, endurance athletes, and helping them to improve performance. But, as I mentioned earlier, there are more sports other than those just involved in endurance. And I think what we were faced with was many sports looking through the window of the laboratories, seeing the type of sports science that was being offered to endurance athletes, and saying, hang on a minute, we'd like some of that action as well. And that's something that we really then needed to challenge ourselves in order to move forward and to try and deliver against those needs. I'll just briefly pause on this slide and point out a couple of things. Firstly, this individual on the treadmill is Mike Dixon, probably one of the greatest unsung heroes, if you can have such a thing, that I think there is in British sport. Mike is one of the best endurance athletes I've ever had the privilege of working with. He's actually a 6-time Olympian. And in sports that you may not normally associate with the Olympics or think too much about, cross-country skiing and biathlon. But Mike was an extremely fit and extremely talented, but indeed a very determined young man. And it was great to have the opportunity to work with him and the British cross-country ski team at Loughborough, and then work with him over many years in different events, and indeed with Richard Blagrove in a reality TV programme that we produced called Hercules back in the early 2000s. But the second thing I'll draw your attention to, and colleagues from the School of Sport, Health and Applied Science may want to look at this fresh-faced young individual standing behind Mike, and you may just recognise him as none other than Dr. Neil Bazolis, who worked with me at Lilleshall on a 12-month internship, and of course is now a senior lecturer here at St Mary's. But as I say, we had sports knocking on the window of the lab, wanting a slice of the action of sports science. And the first to open the door and come in was football. And as Francis has said, I was very lucky and fortunate to be offered my first job as head of human performance by Bobby Robson, the then manager of the England team, and Charles Hughes, his assistant director of coaching. And I was given that job primarily to go over and work at the Lilleshall National Sports Centre in Shropshire. I started out as head of human performance for the FA, working with the boys at the soccer school, but subsequent to that, our lab became independent, the FA pulled out, and we became, as Francis said, the largest independently funded, self-supporting sports science, sports injury and sports rehab centre in the country. And it was a great journey for me to work at Lilleshall. Lilleshall is always somewhere that will be very close to my heart. And I had 20 fantastic years there working with a whole range of elite sportsmen and women, doing what I was passionate about, which was applying sports science to help them improve. But as I said, my first role was to work with boys at the FA soccer school. And as you do when you work with any group of subjects, the first thing that I did was to ask them for their names and their dates of birth. And as I wrote down the dates of birth, I started to think they were maybe pulling my leg, or there was something wrong. Because as you'll see from this next slide, 70% of the boys who went to the FA soccer school, over the years that it was in existence, up until the late 1990s, were born in the first quarter of the academic year, which in the case of football is also the selection year. Perhaps more worryingly, less than 5% were born at this time of the year, the last quarter of the academic year, the summer months. Now, the FA had some convoluted reason for this. They felt it was to do with when they could sign professional forms with clubs. That was utter nonsense. The real reason was that when those boys were selected at 13, 14 years of age, those who were more physically mature tended to be born in the early part of the selection year. An extra 9, 10, 11, even 12 months of physical maturity that they had over the younger ones in the year really made the difference in a physical trial situation. And so they had a real biological advantage. And when we compare that bias to what was shown many years later by Holst, who looked at senior, fully matured individuals in the FA Premier League, we can see that bias still does exist, albeit not quite as strong. Now what that suggests is that what starts out as a biological advantage genuinely becomes a real advantage in later years, because those players get exposed to the top level coaching, they get known by the coaches, and indeed, unfortunately, those who get overlooked, the ones born in the latter part of the year, tend to drop out of sport or do something different. And I do believe that with all the money that we invest in talent identification and then the subsequent development of talent, there is still more work that we can do, and there is still better application of science that can be done to ensure that we don't have this type of bias, because we do need to give an equal opportunity to everyone to take part in sport. And that bias still exists, not just in football, but in many other sports. And it's something that we do need to still do much more work to try to correct. And as I say, there I was at Lewisham, 32 boys, 60 miles from the lab at Loughborough, and I didn't have any means of assessing their fitness. Some of you might recognise a young and fresh-faced Michael Owen, who was one of the boys at the soccer school. So I had no track, I had no lab, so I gave Clyde a ring. I said, what do I do? He said, I've read a manuscript. So a couple of guys in Canada, have a look at it and see what you think. So I read the manuscript, went up to my office in the Victory Hall at Loughborough, programmed into my state-of-the-art BBC microcomputer some timings that gave out a signal, pressed play and record on my cassette recorder, recorded the timings, took it down into the gym in the sports hall, measured out 2 lines 20 metres apart, and yes, you guessed it, that was really the first time that the multi-stage fitness test, now perhaps more commonly known as the bleep test, was ever run in the UK. Very eye-opening for us to develop that test, a real realisation of how you can develop a good quality field test if you base that on robust science. One of my colleagues at Loughborough and I, Dr. Roger Ramsbottom, worked on validating that test and published a paper in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, and it has now become one of the, I use the word advisedly, popular, perhaps unpopular, tests of physical fitness used in schools, clubs, and indeed in the public sector that there is in this country. But the point I wanted to make is that it does, in a sense, emphasise the work that Griffith Boobs did in the mountains. Because if you have good science backing your testing, I believe very firmly that you can take that science into the field and do high-quality field tests that produce good data, that produce good information, and that enable you to work with performers literally in their own backyard to help them improve their performance. And that's something that I've always believed in very strongly over the years, and certainly it's something that we did with the multi-stage fitness test. Now, of course, at the time I was working for the Football Association, and as Francis said, it was a huge honour to be asked by Bobby Robson to accompany him and his support staff to the 1990 World Cup in Italy. For those of you that are wondering, Terry Butcher, Mark Wright, Peter Shilton, Stuart Pearce, David Platt, Gary Lineker, Des Walker, Chris Waddle, the one and only Paul Gascoigne, Peter Beardsley, and Paul Parker, just before our 3rd and 4th place playoff. Because, of course, we reached the semi-final of the 1990 World Cup. And I'll show you this next slide, not for the people that are in it in a sense, but to illustrate the point that at the time, whilst I've been invited by Bobby Robson to be part of the support staff, I think I was sitting somewhere at the back of here, about the 10th row of the stand. Because in 1990, sports science and the involvement of sports scientists within the support staff was still very much on the periphery. And I had a huge amount of resistance from some of the coaching staff, indeed some of the medical staff, to my presence within the support squad. It really was in many ways an uphill battle. And I had to be very determined and very resilient to prove what I could do, to prove the role that sports science could play in enhancing the performance and the preparation of that team. And my role was mainly to look at the acclimatisation, or acclimation I should say, of the England team. Because just like our England team in Brazil last year, we were faced with very hot and humid conditions in Italy. And I had to work out how I could measure their acclimation. And I had no real help, so I decided I would use a couple of tools that were available to me. The first of which was the multi-stage fitness test, and the second was the recent development of some great big watches that you could put on your wrist that monitored heart rate, made by a company called Polar. And what I did was I took the bleep test, and I took it up to a level 11 on each of the squad members. So they didn't have to run to exhaustion, but I ran them up to a level 11, and I measured their heart rate. And I first did that in the cool of Lewisham. And then I went out with the England team, and for the next 2 weeks in Sardinia, I redid the test every couple of days and remeasured their heart rate. And what I was able to show was exactly as we would expect. When they were first exposed to the heat, their heart rate was much higher because their body was physiologically trying to deal with the heat and the humidity that it was encountering. But over the 2 weeks, so the heart rate started to decrease. The heart rate started to come down. And at the end of the 2 weeks, I was able to show that the lines matched and that their response to exercise in the heat of Italy was exactly the same as their response to the same exercise in the cool of Lewisham. And I sat down with each of the players and I went through their data and I told them how they'd acclimatised. And it was great to see their reaction. Despite the resistance from some of the coaches, the players bought into it and gave them that psychological boost that I hope had a big impact on their performance. And I will, if I may, just use my second prop, which is taken from Bobby Robson's autobiography that was published shortly after the 1990 World Cup. And I'll just read this paragraph to you, because I think it epitomises the role in which I was able to play and the way in which we could use science to help that England team's performance. John Brewer talked to the players about the tests and explained what they were about. He was encouraged by their response, and even more so when a few sought him out privately to ask for more information. It is encouraging when you get this sort of reaction. I suspect that 8 years previously, Emlyn Hughes and his crowd would probably have not even been interested, and they would have been more concerned about getting on with their game of cards. The results were encouraging, better than before the Brazil game. Acclimatisation had gone well. No one had put on a pound, not even Gaza, who was very good with his diet. As I say, a great honour to be involved, and when I put this slide together, I was going to close it by saying no England team has done as well as our 1990 team since, or indeed only since, indeed they were the most successful England team since the 1966 winning team in the World Cup. But of course, I'm sure you'll all, like me, wish our other England team, our England ladies, who qualified for their semi-final at the weekend, the very best of luck in their semi-final tomorrow. And I hope they can go one stage better than we did when we went out in the semi-final in Italy. So as I say, I returned in 1990 to an era where more and more sports were trying to get involved in sports science. But one of the problems that we had and we faced was that unlike endurance, where we had a real good understanding of the demands of endurance performance, that understanding was not there in many team sports. If we take football as an example, the only data that we had to go on was from a real iconic landmark study that was written by the late Professor Tom Riley and his colleagues at Liverpool John Moores University. And Tom had set up cameras all around the stadium at Everton's ground, Goodison Park, on the roof. And he put markers around the perimeter board, and he filmed each game. And he then went and laboriously rewound the tapes, watched the films, and used the markers to calculate the distances that players had covered. It took him many days to analyse each player, but at the end of that he was able to publish a paper that showed that on average footballers were covering around 10 kilometres during a game, consisting of about 100 individual sprints, each of 10 to 15 metres in length. He was able to show the recovery time between sprints, the amount of time they could spend walking and jogging. It really was the first, and for many years the only paper that gave us an insight into the demands of a team sport such as football. And with other sports getting involved in sports science, it was still a challenge to gain that information and that knowledge of what underpinned the physiological performance of each of them. And I remember being asked to write a review paper on the physiology of rugby league with my colleague at University of Epigenetics, and we found it very difficult to gain any understanding into the demands of the sport. It's certainly a challenge that we face when more sports want to know or get more support from sports scientists, because we do need to understand the basics behind their performance before we can start to make those recommendations. But in the early 1990s, there was probably what for me was one of the biggest sea changes in our support of sport in this country. And that was the Sports Science Support Programme, initiated by the Sports Council, now known as Sport England, and the Sports Council funded many sports to get sports science support from qualified, accredited sports scientists. The programme was overseen by a great friend of mine, Dr. Sarah Rowell. Sarah would have been here tonight, but she still practices what she preaches. She's managing the England fell running team in the European Mountain Championships in the French Alps at the moment. But Sarah would, as I say, police this programme very, very rigorously. And she would ensure that all the sports scientists linked in with governing bodies of sport had the proper standards of professional practice, but particularly were able to deliver the type of support sports wanted and needed. And those scientists had to be accredited by BASES, the British Association of Sport and Exercise Science, in order to have the qualifications and the ability to work with the teams. And this was really the forerunner of many sports showing and believing in the world and the support that sports science could give them. And I think it did a huge amount to move sports science away from just endurance into many other sports, and really for those sports to buy into the messaging and the support that sports science could deliver. But I will draw your attention to this logo on the right, because as Francis mentioned, I was very fortunate to work with cricket and to go to the England World Cup, or go to the England team to the World Cup in 1990. And I'm delighted that Mickey Stewart, the coach of that team, is with us here tonight. Mickey was a great friend and a great person to work with. Mickey was transformational in the way in which he saw the training and the preparation of cricket players. For the first time, players were prepared for overseas tours. And they were brought to Lilleshall, we worked with them in the lab, but most importantly, we worked with them in the cricket nets as well, to get them fitter, to get them more refined, and to get them prepared, both I think psychologically and physically, for the rigours of an overseas tour. And I was fortunate enough to be funded by the sponsor of the preparation, Patrick Whittingdale, to go out and meet with Mickey and the team at the World Cup in 1990. And I'm going to give this one a go as well. Mickey, you can correct me if I've got it wrong. Neil Fairbrother, Richard Illingworth, Philip Tufnell, Gaston Small, Derek Pringle, Graham Hick, Chris Lewis, Dermot Reeve, physio Laurie Brown, Bob Bennett, Alan Lamb, Alex Stewart, Mickey and Sheila's son, Graham Gooch, the captain, none other than Ian Botham, Philip De Freitas, Robin Smith, and Mickey himself. I think taken at the MCG or the SCG out in Australia in the 1992 Cricket World Cup. And it was great to show how cricketers would start to embrace sports science and to embrace proper preparation. And I think we always used to say that whilst we were facing a lot of stick and criticism from some areas of the media for supposedly getting cricketers to do 100 press-ups and 100 sit-ups before breakfast, or getting them to run marathons, in fact, what we were doing was getting them fitter, more agile, getting them to become aware of the importance of diet and correct preparation for the very first time. And if you fast forward to today, only yesterday I was invited to a seminar that was being given by the Director of Science and Medicine at English Cricket. One of my staff at Lilleshall, Nigel Stockhill, went on to work for many years as the sports scientist with the England team, travelling the world on overseas tours. I think what we saw in the early 1990s was the embedding of a new culture within cricket, and Mickey was absolutely fundamental to doing that, to get cricketers aware and to get them to buy in. Some, of course, were slightly more reluctant than others to take part in the exercise and the warm-up routines, but nevertheless, I do believe that we had a real impact on changing cricket that is still very much inculcated in the sport today. So if we go on to the 1990s, I think what we then started to see was a new breed of sport and exercise scientists. And I like to term them bilingual. Scientists who can speak the language of the coach and the language of the athlete, but very, very importantly, underpin that with the language of the scientist. They don't compromise their messaging. They don't delve into fads or babble that's on the internet. They basic the science, but at the same time they apply it to the athletes to help them improve their performance. And they work with coaches to enhance their knowledge and understanding. Steve McGregor, former graduate of Loughborough, he worked with Alex McLeish on pre-season training at Birmingham City Football Ground. Nick Morgan, who worked with me both at Lilleshall and then subsequently at Glaxo, not putting a plaster on the arm of this tennis player, but collecting his sweat to analyse it for the sodium content, to see whether he needed a specific hydration strategy to help with his sweating and to help replace the electrolytes that he was losing. And of course the development of techniques that meant that we could move from the lab into the field, to conduct tests and experiments in the environment that was familiar to the athletes themselves. And also the development of this, Prozo. I mentioned Tom Riley and his downloading and his laborious hours spent analysing films to calculate distances covered. Today, Prozone is a system that's available at virtually every Premier League ground. To the extent that when a manager goes in on a Monday morning after the game on a Saturday, he can very quickly and very easily see all of the distances covered by all of his players, how hard they were working, how many tackles they've made, how many sprints they've made, and so on. A far, far cry from the era of 25, 30 years ago when Tom, as I say, spent many hours rewinding his films and looking at data. But we've also been able to stretch ourselves and work not just with able-bodied athletes, but with Paralympic athletes as well. A great friend of mine, I've seen just over there, Paul Castle, was my supervisor for my recent PhD. Did a huge amount of work looking at the physiological responses in disabled athletes and Paralympic athletes, particularly their responses to acclimation and to sweating in the heat, because of course their lesions will have a real impact on the amount of fluid that they lose when they sweat and their ability to tolerate and acclimatise to heat. And I'm sure all of us are also very proud and very aware of the great work that Richard Burden is doing here at St Mary's, working with top athletes such as David Weir, applying good science, applying good strength and conditioning techniques to help enhance performance. And another group of athletes, and I use that word in parenthesis, for whom sports science is now very much part of their lives, is refereeing. This gentleman is Howard Webb. Now, some might suggest that both facially and physically we are quite similar. If those of you that know Howard will know that he's about 6'2", so that's where the similarity actually stops. But I was very fortunate that I spent 14 years of my time at Liverpool conducting all of the pre-season fitness testing on every Premier League and Football League referee and linesman. I have to hold my hands up and say that also included doing their eyesight testing. But in those days, we tested their fitness really with a bit of a finger in the wind because we had no idea of what the demands of their sport were. Two of my staff, Simon Breivik and Matt Weston, subsequently went on to work for the Premier League and have now very much made sports science support for refereeing fundamental to their daily lives. Every referee has a strict diet that they follow. They have to download their heart rate data after every training session and every match, and their pre-season and in-season training programs are based on their data and prescribed by the sports scientist Simon Breivik. It's a real area where there has been a huge change in the scientific approach and the scientific support of officiating. And I often do think of them as the 23rd player on the field of play because the distances that they cover and the demands placed on them are quite significant. But I'll move on because, as I mentioned, I spent much of my career before I entered academia in business, running my own business, and then subsequently being employed by one of the largest companies in the world, and certainly in the UK, and that is GlaxoSmithKline. Now, GlaxoSmithKline, of course, are a pharmaceutical company, but they owned, in those days, an iconic brand, Lucozade. And those of you of my age will remember Lucozade as the drink that you were probably bought when you were off school ill, in the big glass bottle with the dimpled top in a cellophane wrapper. But it's true to say that sports science was responsible for one of the greatest transformations of any brand that has been seen in this country. Because partly as a result of the work that people like Professor Ron Moore did at Aberdeen, Clyde's work at Loughborough, Lucozade decided they would completely change their brand structure. And from Lucozade, they went to Lucozade Sport. The isotonic drink, based on the results of numerous scientific studies, a 6.4% carbohydrate solution containing electrolytes, particularly potassium and sodium, designed to enhance the uptake of both fluid and fuel carbohydrate during exercise. And as a result of that, Lucozade Sport, of course, is used at the London Marathon. Lucozade remained one of the largest sponsors of the London Marathon because we know that two of the biggest challenges that marathon runners face is a loss of fluid and a loss of fuel. But it's also used in many other sports, and just similar in the way that sports science has evolved into other sports. So Lucozade Sport now works closely, providing isotonic drinks, refueling and rehydrating, particularly focusing, I believe, on the hydration challenge that many team sports and many individuals will face. But I think it's also worth reflecting on the fact that business has a huge role to play in the dissemination of good quality science to the people who businesses would call consumers. Because of course they have a vested interest to do that, because it's the consumers who go out there and buy their products. But we shouldn't overlook the excellent work that businesses can do, often in partnership with academics, to disseminate, to educate and enhance our understanding. And in my time at Lucozade, I was very fortunate to revisit an event that I first started out on in 1982. And I should add that when I was doing my postgraduate work, I slightly improved on my previous performance by completing the race in 84, 85 and 86. But when I went to Lucozade, I was asked to go and start delivering seminars on hydration and refueling to all of the runners. And it was a great privilege to be asked to do that. And I think perhaps one of the best examples of the way in which we can take the science and apply it to our understanding of our health for athletes is firstly using the knowledge that in a sense was gained by Pew in his work on the mountains, which showed by looking at respiratory data that if we run at too high an intensity, if we run too quickly, we burn that limited store of glycogen very rapidly. The analogy that I use, it's a bit like being at the traffic lights and when the lights turn green, putting your foot flat on the pedal and accelerating away very rapidly. You might think it's great, you might think it's cool, but actually the engine is burning that fuel at a high rate. it's the same with marathon running. You might feel great at the start, the helicopters, the crowds, the excitement. You set off thinking, today's the day I'm going to run a minute a mile faster than I've ever done before. Possibly exactly the same mistake that I made in 1982. But if you do that, the damage is being done under the skin. You're revving the engine and burning the carbohydrate. So what we did at Lucozade was we produced something very simple. We produced pace bands. It said, okay, if your target time is 4 hours, use this pace band and it will show you the split times, the mile marker times that you need to reach each mile at if you're going to run at a steady, sensible pace. And we produce those target times, those pace bands, for a whole range of different times. A great example of how business can use science to apply that knowledge to help our understanding and to help make performance not necessarily easier, but certainly safer and more effective for many sports people. But there are other areas where business is involved with science, particularly, of course, the development of clothing, footwear, apparel, and the development of technology such as footballs that have the right aerodynamics to give the right bend, the right excitement, the right experience for players and coaches. Indeed, this one, the swimsuit, was almost too successful because the reduction in drag was such huge improvements in performance based on the scientific development of clothing that it was ultimately banned and couldn't be used anymore. But of course, as well, I will just spend a few moments talking about the role that business has to play in funding and supporting science. Colleagues here at St Mary's will know that I'm a very strong believer in going out and trying to get funding for business, both to develop new products, to develop new ideas, and to enhance our understanding of how we can work with science to improve human performance. I'm delighted that Jess Hill has recently received funding from Curio to investigate whether compression garments genuinely do have an impact on performance and on recovery. We've received a grant from a company called Smart Life to look at how technology can be embedded into clothing to measure things like core temperature and heart rate. Charlie Pedler and his fantastic work with Orico, a company that are funding the delivery of sports science to many elite sports teams across the globe, is something that all of us at St Mary's are very proud of, and it's a great example of how business and academia can work together to enhance performance and enhance understanding. And only yesterday, we signed a contract with this company that produce motorised electric wheels, a version of the Segway that you may see if you go on holiday. We've been asked to look at the physical demand placed upon the riders. Vice Chancellor, we put you down as a volunteer for the first stage of the study. And moving on, as Francis said, I've also been very privileged to be on the board of UK AntiDoping, and I'm delighted that David Kenworthy, the chairman of UK AntiDoping, is also here tonight. The fight against doping in sport is one that I don't think will ever go away, but I am very pleased and proud of the way in which we can use science to help in that battle and to help ensure that we do have clean sport. But my first involvement in anti-doping actually came before I joined the board of UCAD, because I was at Glaxo. You may remember that Greg Rosetsky, towards the end of his career, tested positive for nandrolone, a banned substance. But uniquely, Rosetsky was able to show that that banned nandrolone came from the supplements that the ATP, the Association of Tennis Professionals, were providing in the locker room for players. So the ATP came to us at Glaxo and said, can you produce a range of supplements that are guaranteed to be free of World Anti-Doping Agency banned substances? So we did that. We worked very closely with our Lucozade brand, and we developed this, the informed sport process, which is working with a laboratory in Newmarket, HFL, now owned by the Laboratory of Government Chemists, to screen supplements before they are released onto the market, and particularly to screen them for the WADA banned substances. And that work is absolutely fundamental in giving athletes the reassurance that they need that when they take supplements, there is a minimal risk of there being a banned substance within them. Now, I chair the athlete committee for UK Anti-Doping, and I have to say from experience of talking to our athletes that the fear of an inadvertent contamination from a supplement is something that haunts them pretty much 24 hours a day. And the more we can use science to analyse products, to develop good quality sports nutrition products that are free of World Anti-Doping Agency banned substances, the more we can give those athletes the assurance that they need. But as I say, UCAD is working very hard. It is, I'm proud to say, one of, if not the best national anti-doping organisations in the world. Our mission is to try to protect the right for athletes to take part in clean sport. And whilst I won't bore you with all of these numbers, the one that I will draw your attention to is this, because last year 11 sports were placed onto the ABP, or Athlete Biological Passport. Now, traditionally, when we've had teams and individuals into laboratories and we've collected physiological and blood data and anthropometric data on them, we've stored them on a hard drive or in the filing cabinet and updated them when they've come in to see whether they've changed as a result of training or acclimatization or an injury. But the ABP looks at it in a different way. Because what the ABP is exactly what it says. It's a passport that measures those biological variables and looks for any changes, but particularly changes that might be outside the norm that we would expect. Changes that are adverse, changes that are too great, perhaps too small, compared to what we would normally see as a result of training, activation, or even of injury. And if we see those changes and they start to create a flashing amber light or even a red light, then that in itself won't be an adverse test, but what it will do is trigger further investigation and potentially further drug tests on that individual. So the Athlete Biological Passport is really transforming the way in which we work with athletes to chart and monitor their progress. And I'm proud that science is very much at the heart of that. But as I draw to a conclusion, I'll come on to the slightly more glamorous part of sport, the part that I suspect many of our undergraduates, postgraduates here at St Mary's and in universities across the country would like to hope and think that they can go and work in. And that's the role that science can play in helping us to win medals. And I'll draw your attention, I think, to the medals table for London 2012, when of course we finished third. A fantastic performance, and probably in many ways one that has us using the phrase punching above our weight compared to many other nations. Whilst a lot of that, of course, is due to talented athletes, is due to great development programs within national governing bodies, I would also suggest that much of it is due to the great science and medicine support that we in this country can provide for our athletes. Led in terms of science by Professor Ken Van Somberen, who's here tonight, the medicine side delivered by Dr. Mike Loosemore, all ensuring that our athletes have access to the best medicine and the best science. To give them what Sir David Brailsford would call the marginal gains, those small gains that make the difference between success and failure. And I'll draw your attention to this picture at the bottom, which isn't in fact from the London 2012 Games. It's actually Matthew Pinson, and he's winning his fourth gold medal, his fourth and final gold medal. The difference between him in first place and the Canadians in second place is 10 centimetres over a 2,000 metre difference. That's 0.0005% of a difference in performance. That difference separated him from his fourth gold, and in many ways much of the fame and genuine kudos that he's received subsequently. And I would argue that science, when applied properly, through good coaching, through good application to athletes and training, must be able to make a difference that is much more than that. So I do believe that science has a role to play. It is not the main predeterminant of success, but it is certainly absolutely critical. And we only have to look at the lifestyle of many of our top athletes to realise the areas where science can help. In terms of recovery, in terms of refuelling, in terms of psychological strategies to cope with travel and with being away from home. Athletes who are competing regularly, twice a day, 6 or even 7 days a week. Science can absolutely help to underpin and support performance in those areas. We genuinely have moved a long way from the laboratory where we were only working with endurance performers. So where next? Now I mentioned, it was suggested that I would use props. So I'm going to use as my final prop the Waldegrave drawing room. Now when Walpole devised and designed this great room some 250 years ago, I suspect it wasn't on his mind that the length of the drawing room, just short of 18 metres, is equivalent to the winning triple jump leap of Christian Taylor in the 2012 London Olympic Games. I say that because I think it shows the type of performance that many of our elite athletes can produce. But it gets a little bit better because the width of just under 8 metres is almost the same as Greg Rutherford's winning leap in the long jump. In fact, Greg jumped a little bit longer than that. And there is one, in fact, there are two final measures. The top of the door, the archway, is just over 8 feet. That's the world record height for the high jump set by Sotomayor in 1993. And finally, and I think this is the most impressive, and again, I don't think Walpole had this on his mind 250 years ago, the ceiling is just 3 centimetres higher than the world record for the pole vault. quite phenomenal performances. And I do believe that if we are going to continue pushing back the boundaries of performance and enhancing world records and supporting athletes to achieve that, there has to be an interface of course, great physiology, of course, great coaching, of course, really talented athletes, but science has to play a role as well, because otherwise we'll never see triple jumping going further or pole vaulting going higher, because the boundaries and the performances really are quite extreme. The great buzzword in sports science at the moment is epigenetics. Can we change the human genome? Can we use different methods of training or nutrition to influence and change the genetic predisposition of our athletes? Or can we identify those with a genetic predisposition to respond in a specific way to certain types of training or to certain types of nutrition? It's still a work in progress, but it's still an area of great interest and of great excitement. But I will, as I draw to a close, return to something that's a common thread in a sense that has run through this evening's presentation, and that's the marathon. And the world record for the marathon, set by Dennis Kometo in September last year in Berlin, as you can see, is 2 hours, 2 minutes and 57 seconds. That's a phenomenal 4 minutes and 42 seconds for each mile. It wasn't that long ago that people were marvelling at Roger Bannister breaking the 4-minute mile. Now we've got a guy who can run 26 consecutive miles, not a great deal slower than that. What does that mean in real terms? 12.75 miles an hour, just under 6 metres a second. 3 seconds to complete the length of the drawing room, but done not just for 3 seconds, but for another 2 hours, 2 minutes and 54 seconds. If I then return to our paper, our marathon paper of 1984, where we looked at running economy, well, we worked out that on average, runners will use about 5 millilitres of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute for each mile an hour of their pace. And we multiply 5 by 12.75, as a rough estimate, that would suggest that Mr. Kometo is using about 64 mils of oxygen continuously during the marathon. For those of you that aren't familiar with sports science, that value is higher than the maximum value that you can see in many top-class athletes. But we also found, as I mentioned earlier, that elite runners can sustain about 80% of their maximum for the 26.2 mile distance. So if we do some reverse maths on that, and say, well, 64 is 80%, so what does that mean? Well, it means he's probably roughly got a VO2 max of around 80. Now that's actually quite manageable. It's a sort of value that we see quite frequently in many sports science labs on elite athletes. So it is quite achievable, it is quite sustainable. But I mentioned just now the 4-minute mile as one of the iconic barriers. Probably the last remaining iconic barrier in running is the sub-2-hour marathon. And I've been asked on many occasions by the media whether I think the 2-hour marathon will ever be broken. And I think the answer is a categoric yes. I don't know when, but I certainly don't think it's an if. I think it certainly will be. What does that mean in real terms? Well, it's just under 4 minutes 35 seconds per mile. 7 seconds a mile quicker than Mr. Kometo is currently running at for his world record. What does that equate to in speed? Well, you can see the speeds there, 13.2 miles an hour, just under 6 metres a second, 5.9. If we do the same calculations, that's an estimated VO2 this time of 66, a VO2 max of around 83. Again, the sort of value that is achievable has been measured in laboratories, and that's what starts me to think, yes, I do think it's achievable. On the right day, with the right athlete, with the right support. In practical terms, what does that mean? Well, it means that the sub-2-hour marathon record holder will need to be pulling away from the current world record holder by 43 metres for each mile, finishing about 1.2, 1.3 kilometres ahead of him at the finish. It's a tall order, but I do think that, as I said just then, with the right athlete, the right physiology, and certainly with the right application of science to support that individual in terms of training, in terms of acclimation, climatization, in terms of nutrition, and in terms of pacing and pacing strategy, absolutely, I think at some point in the future that will occur. To close off, finish with something of slightly more mundane nature when it comes to marathon running. As the Vice-Chancellor mentioned, I've completed the London Marathon successfully now, I should add, on 17 occasions. And for the last 4 years, through my involvement with the London Marathon, I've been asked to act as a celebrity chaperone in some ways, or as my previous Vice-Chancellor used to say, a celebrity stalker. And this year, at relatively short notice, I was asked to run with somebody who at the time I'd never heard of. I got a phone call from the marathon office 2 days before the race. Without that, I had done an element of training and I was intending to run it anyway. Asking me if I'd run with a guy called Greg James. What I've subsequently discovered is that if you're under the age of 25, you'll know who Greg James is. I certainly didn't. He's the drive time presenter on Radio 1. But when I dug a little bit into his background, I found that he got about 2 million followers on Twitter and Facebook. And we set off on that Sunday morning to run the race together. And up until that time, I'd had no real problem with any of the celebrities that I'd helped to get around the course. And the eagle-eyed ones amongst you may also recognise this lady, Helen George, who joined us. She's an actress from Call the Midwife. And this picture was taken at around the 8 or 9 mile mark on Surrey Keys when things were going well. But, perhaps ironically, as we got close to that subway at 24 miles, the one that I had a fairly painful encounter with some 33 years ago, Greg looked down on me, and you can see there was a high difference. It's the only marathon I've ever finished with a sore neck as well as sore legs. He said, "John, I've had enough. I'm going to drop out. I can't go any longer." And I thought, right, this is it. This is the first crisis that I've faced in the celebrity running era that I've had in the marathon. I tell you what I'll do, I'll call on my 30 years experience as an applied sports scientist. And I started off with what I thought would work straight away, which is a bit of sports psychology. And I said, look, Greg, we've run about 90% of the course. Think how badly you'll feel if you drop out now. Think how great you'll feel when we cross the finish line. Zone out. Don't think about yourself. Let the crowds carry you. Let them psychologically motivate you to the finish. He said, no, John, that's not going to work. I've had enough. I'm going to drop out. But okay, what shall I try next? I'll try a bit of nutrition. But remembering those studies that ask you, can drummers done showing that just the taste of something sweet can enhance performance. I said, I'll tell you what, Greg, I've still got a carbo gel in my back pocket. There's a Lucozade sports station coming up. Get something sweet into your mouth. That'll give you a real boost. It'll help you get to the finish line. John, if I have anything sweet, I'm going to be ill. I'm telling you now, I've had enough. I'm going to drop out. Okay, starting to get a little bit desperate. Then I remember those studies that we'd done on the marathon runners where we found that if they change their gait and they shorten the length in their stride, they can unlock some extra muscle glycogen from somewhere that gives them that extra boost of energy. So I said, look, Greg, you've got long legs, change your stride length. Go a bit shorter, go a bit longer. That might help. John, I'm having enough. I'm going to sit down on the side of the road. I am going to drop out. So I thought, what do? Do I stay with him? I'll try one more trick. So this time I used a bit of physiology. And I said, Greg, we're coming up to the subway. Let's walk. That'll decrease your exercise intensity. It'll lower your heart rate. It'll decrease your core temperature. You'll feel better. And we can walk and we can jog to the finish. By this time, we were going through the subway and coming out into the full glare of the publicity of the embankment. And he looked at me and said, John, I'm going to sit at the side of the road. I've had enough. I'm going to drop out. And as I said, by now we were out there, in amongst all these people, thousands of people screaming his name, asking him to marry them. It was incredible. And I had, in the end, one final piece of inspiration. And I threw 30 years of sports science training out of the window. And I said, Greg, they've all got mobile phones, they've all got iPads. If you drop out now, you're going to go viral on Twitter in just the way that you've done one within about 5 minutes. And he looked at me and said, crikey, John, I hadn't thought of that. So I think that is what, for me, something that emphasises, I guess, that yes, science is important, and yes, science has a role to play. But it's only one small part of the overall jigsaw. I've been privileged to work with many top athletes, celebrities, and many people in all walks of life over the years. It's been a fantastic career and a fantastic privilege to work in applied sports science. But as a scientist, I can't finish without presenting a little bit of data. You'll see that both Greg, and you can't see it on my foot, had a chip on our feet that all the runners had, that monitors our split times during the race. And just to prove that that story actually was true, that's Greg's fatigue during the last 5 or 10 kilometres of the marathon. And this was his social media moment. Twitter and perhaps a global exposure and being shown to drop out really gave him that boost of energy. So whereas my first paper was on the metabolic challenge of the marathon, I did speculate on whether this could be the title of our next paper. The only problem is, given the constraints of statistics and the need for a large number of subjects, I don't think I'll ever be allowed to collect the amount of data that is required to publish that in an academic journal. Thank you again for your time. I hope you've enjoyed the talk this evening. Thank you, Vice Chancellor, for giving me the opportunity to present tonight, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.